Welcome to Chautauqua People. My name is John Viehe. My guest today is the Reverend Robert Franklin, who is the new Director of the Department of Religion at Chautauqua and pastor to the Chautauqua Congregation. Robert is a native of Chicago, South Side. He went to college at Morehouse. Afterward, he went to the Harvard University Divinity School, earned an MDiv, went to University of Chicago, where he acquired a PhD, and following the awarding of his PhD, came to upstate New York as a faculty member at Colgate-Rochester Divinity School. While he was at Colgate-Rochester, his wife completed a residency in OBGYN at Strong Memorial Hospital of the University of Rochester. Welcome to Chautauqua People.
Thank you, John.
Robert, what were some of the family influences that steered you to the ministry?
I'd say the single most important and influence was my grandmother, Martha McCann, who was a church missionary at our local congregation in Chicago. And the thing that I remember most was that Grandma prepared every weekend on Saturdays. She was in the kitchen, no matter how hot the day in July or August, preparing these large pots of fresh vegetables, corn and collard greens and all sorts of wonderful food. And then, after preparing it, she'd take these large pots, or smaller, put them in the smaller pots, and then load us all into the car, myself and three brothers at the time, and we'd drive into the inner city of Chicago, into the most impoverished neighborhoods, large tenements, and walk with this food up 2 and 3 flights sometimes to deliver it to families that were sick and shut in. And they were always thrilled to see us coming. Grandma would show up with food, but also would pray with families that were that had an ill family member, and would feed people. And so I saw service, I saw faith in action manifest through service. And it was a remarkable and deeply imprinting experience for me.
Right. And so that became a basis and a model to copy in your own ministry, did it not?
It certainly did.
Now, you told me that you also had an important developmental experience during your junior year when you were abroad at Durham University in England. And how did that fit in the bigger picture?
Yes. Well, I was a junior year abroad student and spent an entire year overseas. So it was a great honor to do that. I was transplanted from, in this case, I was a college student in Atlanta, Georgia at Morehouse College, and was suddenly found myself in a small county in northern England at Durham University. By the way, Durham University found its way into the Harry Potter film series, as it was one background for part of that movie. In any case, while there, I was part of a university Bible study, and that was a very important experience, reading the work of C.S. Lewis and some of the great Christian theologians and pastors of the day. But then during vacation time, we were allowed, in fact encouraged, to travel. And so I traveled to Spain and to North Africa, to Morocco. And at the end of the year, I traveled to the Soviet Union, then Soviet Union, today Russia. And it was remarkable, the 3 belief systems that I encountered, the Catholicism of Spain, the Islam in Morocco, and then kind of atheism in the Soviet Union. And I was just fascinated by the comparisons, the continuities and the differences in the various belief systems. So when I returned to Morehouse for my senior year, I was just in a swirl, trying to make sense of what I had witnessed firsthand and needed to read more. And that ultimately set me on the course for later study at Harvard Divinity School.
And what happened at Harvard then? Were there further expansions of this set of questioning?
I was able for the first time to go deeper on the question of what do the various faith traditions have in common, and how do they differ, why they differ, and what's significant. And ultimately, it was about a search for common ground in these various traditions. And I discovered, I mean, the importance and centrality of compassion and love, for instance, the importance of the golden rule, as Jesus talked about it, found in really all of the big five, if you will, of Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, so it was a powerful experience to be able to undertake that kind of comparative study.
I find that this is very common among clergy who are at Chautauqua. And someone I interviewed several weeks ago was a high school classmate, Doug May, who is an ordained Roman Catholic priest. He was here for Egypt Week. His status is both Coptic and Roman Catholic. And he explained that he spent several years in Germany as an Air Force enlisted man. And indeed, if we talked to him about what's important, we had a meal together to get to this. Indeed, he comes back and has some wonderful things to say about Martin Luther.
Yes.
And I thought to myself, you are a genuine Chautauquan with such a broad. That isn't that he's lost his point of view. Now, you made some comments when we talked earlier about your views on the current Pope Francis. What if you could share those?
Well, I think of moral leaders as women and men who act with imagination and integrity in the public square to serve the common good. And Pope Francis strikes me as an extraordinary moral leader on our global stage today, a person who has the capacity to move people outside their own self-interest and to think about the needs of others, to consider serving others, to consider working for peace among differing peoples. And I think that is so important. His humility inspires. His willingness to reconcile those who are in tension inspires. And I think this is an exceedingly important time for the world to hear from leaders like Pope Francis, and of course there are many others, the Dalai Lama, even a young Pakistani girl, teenager like Malala Yousafzai. All are moral leaders that I think we need to pay more attention to. And one of the things I love about the Chautauqua Institution is an ability to invite such leaders to Chautauqua.
Right, and I hope we will continue to do that and increase the breadth.
Yes.
That's a personal aside of mine. Now, how did you find out about Chautauqua?
Well, I resided in Rochester, New York, and my dentist at the time was a Chautauquan. And one day he spoke to me during a visit about this incredible place and the speakers there, and he said, "Robert, you should consider visiting sometime." And, you know, I was grateful for the invitation, didn't think much more about it. And then on 3 subsequent occasions, I heard on public radio programs recorded at the Chautauqua Institution. A concert by the Chautauqua Symphony Orchestra, a performance by Garrison Keillor, and then a lecture by Glenn Lowry, then of Harvard University. And when I realized all of these remarkable ideas and performances and music and the arts and religion were at Chautauqua, I thought this is really truly a national treasure, and I'm ashamed of myself, I don't know much about it, I need to learn more. And ultimately had the wonderful invitation in the year 2000 by my terrific predecessor, the Reverend Dr. Joan Brown Campbell, to come and speak at Chautauqua, and fell in love with the place.
Okay. Now, initially you were a speaker, and that was probably 1 session or 2 sessions. And then you had some more substantial involvements, did you not?
That's right. So after speaking as a 10:45 lecturer, a 2 o'clock lecturer, a week chaplain, I was then able to serve as a theologian in residence for 2005 and spent the entire 9-week season at Chautauqua. I actually worked on a book during that time. Chautauqua was a wonderful place for poets and writers and creative people to find both intellectual stimulation, but also the kind of setting, this wonderful bucolic setting by the lake where one can think, listen, have good conversations. And so that was my longest exposure to Chautauqua.
Right. And then you came on the board of trustees at the institution, and shortly thereafter you were appointed to the presidency of Morehouse.
Correct.
Now, I was on the board at the time, and I remember we had a few very light conversations, just getting to know one another. And then you said the focus has to be on Morehouse,
Yes.
and gave up your seat on the board of trustees. And the job of a college president is a demanding one, is it not?
It is. And it's 80% fundraising. So my board really strongly suggested that I use the time I was serving on other nonprofit boards to advance the cause of Morehouse, increasing scholarship dollars for our students.
And that has to happen, does it? I mean, that's not foul play. That's the job of the president, and it should be understood.
Sure.
Now, you wrote a wonderful letter, and I think I shared with you. I've lost my copy of the letter, and you spoke about the standards for a good Morehouse student. I think you've summarized it. The letter had more than these 5 points, but tell us about the 5 wells.
Ah, yes. Well, thanks for asking, John, because I love to talk about these 5 wells. At Morehouse, I said every student should aspire to become well-read, well-spoken, well-traveled, well-dressed, and well-balanced. And together, these comprise the characteristics of a Renaissance man or Renaissance woman with a social conscience and a global perspective. The first time I gave the speech, I think you commented on how you thought, parents would admire that simple vision from a college president, and the parents really did love it. In fact, when I mentioned well-dressed, they all cheered. I wasn't so sure the students were that thrilled about it. But a month after delivering the speech at the freshman orientation, I saw a student walk across campus with a T-shirt with the 5 wells printed on it, and I thought, okay, I think we passed the T-shirt test. So
We've got it.
I knew we were in the end zone.
Good. And so that worked out immensely well. Now, you stayed at Morehouse for 5 years, and then came to have a sabbatical. Did I understand that correctly?
Correct.
Tell us about your sabbatical.
This was an opportunity to begin and return to some work that I had done earlier, asking the question, what's happening to families, congregations, not just churches, but all congregations, and schools in modern America. And what I argued essentially was that an earlier emphasis on both cognitive or intellectual development and character development was eroding. We were getting so focused on test taking and getting high scores and getting the SAT and ACT scores to get into preferential universities. And we were losing a sense of a focus on the development of the character of students, their values. And so I argued in the book, Crisis in the Village, that we need to restore that balance, cognitive and character development. And I wanted to return to that work with a specific focus on how boys and young men were doing. And I discovered that there was this vast literature out there that I hadn't paid much attention to that was essentially saying America's boys are in trouble. They're falling behind at every level, especially in the high school and college levels. And so I began to explore, did some international travel, interviewed a lot of people, and still working on what I want to do with that, whether that's a book or a series of talks and lectures. But one opportunity will be to focus some of that thinking in the 2015 season at Chautauqua Institution, where there will be, as you know, a week on boys and young men.
Right. Now, in preparation for our session today, I looked at some paperwork and came across what I think summarizes the situation quite well. I'm going to make trouble for Devin. This is a publication that came to me from the local school district, and it appeared in my post office box. And they have salutatorians and valedictorians here. They have 2 lists, and the reason being that they now have students from 2 different schools. And we look at the top 4, all females, and then we go to back here where they have a group who are honored for their service, top seniors, all females. So this is not just a national academic situation,
Yes.
is it?
This is really a challenge. In fact, some educators are suggesting this represents, that is, boys falling behind, represents a threat to our national prosperity and ultimately to our national security. We can't afford to have large numbers of boys and young men who are disengaging academically, who are dropping out of major institutions. And boys who don't do well in school tend not to be employed, tend not to be marriageable or interested in marriage, or these terrific girls aren't interested in marrying guys that aren't really performing. And so this is going to be a challenge, and we all need to wrap our brains around this, pull together, work hard. During the 2015 season at Chautauqua Institution, we'll be bringing in some leaders, principals and teachers, and I hope some of the local Chautauqua County leadership will join us then, because we got to put our best ideas on the table and puzzle out how do we capture these boys. Boy Scouts does a terrific job. Many of our churches and synagogues have terrific programs engaging boys, but typically boys sort of drop out in the late adolescent years, and they disengage from houses of worship, disengage from family life. Marriage rates are dropping among boys and young men in their 20s and 30s. So this is a larger problem, and I think this wonderful newsletter highlights the early symptoms. This is the kind of canary in the cave. If there are no boys performing at the top levels, we ought to ask. Not, we should celebrate girls.
Indeed.
Girls are doing a terrific job. Girls have often been discouraged from academic performance in the past, but now a new challenge is before us.
Right. No, I taught in college psychology in a community college full-time for a decade, 12 years after military retirement, and found a significant number of boys who came in who had sat at home for a year. Their parents got mad at them, and it was an immense challenge to play coach to them.
Yes.
and to batter them. And occasionally it would be as tough as we would talk to a troop who was misbehaving, have them in the corner tapping on their breastbone saying, you can do better than this, and maybe a little coarse language.
Yes.
Many of them responded to it like they would a coach,
Yeah,
saying you're not giving me your best,
Yeah.
and you're the loser in the long run.
Yeah.
And
Well, John, I can see you in that role as a military officer, really getting these guys whipped into shape. And we need more coaches in classrooms, demanding and eliciting teamwork, discipline, obedience, etc., from these young men.
That's right, that's right. And so that's a significant one. Let's make a little diversion now. And I want to talk about a set of papers you spent some time with, and those are the papers of Martin Luther King. Could you tell us about that project?
Yes, Stanford University has a digital copy of everything Dr. King wrote. Of course, Dr. King left Morehouse College, went on to Crozer Seminary, which later merged with the Colgate-Rochester,
Indeed.
which is why the Martin Luther King legacy is very strong in Rochester, New York. And then he went on to Boston University to complete his PhD. So the papers from Boston University are there at Boston University. However, Stanford has a digital copy, and Stanford slowly is publishing the entire corpus of Dr. King's papers. I spent a year there in those papers exploring Dr. King's wisdom and thinking, how he felt about interfaith collaboration, what he had to say about young people, and especially this question that I've been interested in from my Morehouse days. Of course, Morehouse is one of the only 4 remaining liberal arts colleges that's all male. There are over 50 all women's colleges remaining. And so I asked the question, what would Dr. King say to young boys and young men today about their development, about their community service, about being smart and cool, etc.? And so I have some wonderful notes that I'll later publish.
And I've heard it said, and I'm admitting I'm not as well read as I would like, that you could take some of the writings of Martin Luther King during the 20th century, which is his century, and you could bind them together and edit them carefully, and it would read like a gospel for the 20th century.
Yes, indeed.
And I hope at some point,
Yes,
as our pastor, you'll share a concise
I certainly will.
collection that all of us should read
That's
at
right.
some time. Now let's come to the future here. And on the 6th of January 2014, there were 2 major arrivals at Chautauqua. What were they?
Well, that was my first day at work in Chautauqua. I flew in from Atlanta into Buffalo, and as we were driving, a driver picked me up and to drive me to Chautauqua Institution. We heard on the radio the New York State Police had closed the highway. They were closing it in 2 hours. So we were going to be among the last cars to make it through on the highway. Well, why are they closing the highway? Because the second great arrival was the arrival of the polar vortex. The cold, the frigid cold, and snow was coming. and it was an extraordinary welcome to Western New York for me.
Yeah, you know, all I can say is, you've been to Rochester, you had some idea what you're getting into.
You're absolutely right, John.
But it's worse here, is it not?
Oh, it was amazing. And sitting there that first night after I arrived from dinner, listening to newscasters say, do not go outside. It is dangerous to be outdoors. The wind can damage your lungs. And I thought, oh my God, this is Siberia. But we endured. I had to find new wardrobe to deal with the cold. But I love this. I love this region.
So you got sewn into your long underwear for the
indeed
for the winter.
Took those right through the spring. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, tell me what your initiatives are. You've had a chance to sort it out in 6 months and a better part of a season to think about it. What are your initiatives? What are the high points for your ministry here, directorship at Chautauqua?
Well, I'm building on a terrific foundation set by early precursors from Ralph Lowe and Bill Jackson to Joan Brown Campbell and Ross McKenzie. All have been terrific inspiration for me. And I'd say the number one focus is to deepen the spiritual life of the Chautauqua Institution. We do that through ensuring a strong Sunday morning worship service for Christian tradition, and throughout the weekend there's Jummah prayer on Fridays for the Muslim community. There are wonderful Shabbat or Sabbath services for the Hebrew communities that are present. Deepening the spiritual life, our connection and communion with the holy, with God. Second is ensuring the finest theological scholarship in the world comes to Chautauqua for our 2 o'clock afternoon interfaith lectures. The third focus has been to really broaden and strengthen the interfaith dialogue and collaboration of these various traditions. And here again, I'm really inheriting and building on a wonderful Abrahamic tradition, or the Judaism, Christianity, and Islam traditions, religions of the book as they're called.
Right.
And then the other is really to strengthen our outreach to young people. I think all of us are worried about young people, their increasing, or I should say decreasing, degree of affiliation with traditional houses of worship. The Pew Research Centers indicated that over 30% of young people under the age of 30 are reporting for their religious affiliation none. So we're calling them now the religious nuns, N-O-N-E, and they have no affiliation. What implications does that have for the future of our communities, for our churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples, but also for our family life? And we think that there's something important added when people are part of these religious communities. Right. They give us things to believe in and hope for. They give us codes of ethics, ways to live our lives, and they give us community, people who love us, care for us when we're not doing well. And all these are an important part of the public good that religion serves.
Now, when we began, you mentioned the big five faiths. And yet, if we look at the Abrahamic initiative, that speaks about three.
Yes.
And I look at my academic ground, and I have some very solid, dark-skinned Hindus from India, wonderful academicians, warm people. There's a large, because of our immigration laws, there's a large group of professionals in the medical field from that. And I also look at my time in Asia, 5 years in Korea, and having had some wonderful Koreans who are Buddhist, and being teased a little bit, tell me the difference. And the gentleman had a set of Roman Catholic rosary beads and Jewish beads, and it wasn't being ugly about things, but indeed I hope we can continue to broaden our perspective.
Absolutely. One great theologian, Swiss theologian Hans Küng, said, "Until there will be no peace in the world, until there is peace among the religions. And there will be no peace among the religions until there is dialogue." And we intend to expand the interfaith dialogue at the Chautauqua Institution to include the over 3 billion Asians who embrace Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Confucianism, Taoism, the many traditions that are there.
And I'm certain somebody will complain about it. And
yes.
I'm an old Chautauqua family with a lots of clergy in the background, but
Yes.
I think that's appropriate, and that's what we should be doing.
Yes. And I think as long as, the center of Chautauqua's historic identity is, of course, Christian and
Yes,
a
sir.
Protestant Christian presence. The Sunday morning worship preserves that core tradition and legacy. I don't foresee that changing,
No.
but there's plenty of room for interfaith dialogue and cooperation around that center.
As we had some years ago, Roman Catholic cardinal,
Yes.
there's no reason why we shouldn't have
Indeed.
somebody from some of the other traditions
Yes.
who's well-spoken and shares our values. Now, we have just 4 minutes left to talk. I wonder if you could tell me about the Martin Luther King House and how you see that fitting into issues here at Chautauqua.
Well, we think that Martin Luther King represents a symbol of unity and of emphasizing the common ground among various faith traditions. When he walked through the streets of America demanding justice and greater racial inclusion, greater opportunity for people who were poor of all ethnic racial groups, Dr. King joined arm in arm with rabbis, with leaders from the Orthodox Christian and Catholic Christian communities, with Muslims, with Buddhists like Thich Nhat Hanh, and many, many others. So King brings people together in an interfaith kind of way. But there's also an opportunity for Chautauqua to broaden its appeal to the growing African American and Latino American communities out there. And we're very excited about the opportunity to do that in a way that fully integrates with the current programs, the values, and the culture of Chautauqua, so that it's not a separatist kind of effort, but an effort to say, every community wants to have a place that they can call their own, where they feel comfortable, where people can come together, just as the current denominational houses at Chautauqua are wonderful expressions of particularity, but joined arm in arm with the whole community. And I think that's the vision of the Martin Luther King House, to invite the numerous predominantly African American denominations and Latino denominations into Chautauqua, but to ensure that they are united and integrated into the whole.
So that becomes a tool then for inclusion for others.
Indeed.
I wonder if you could sort of talk me through a timeline, an ideal, what major events you see happening for the creation of that.
Yeah, well, this is not a project sponsored by the Department of Religion or the Chautauqua Institution at all.
Really?
In fact, it's a group of volunteers. It's clergy leaders and business leaders who are coming together who want to see this happen, and they have to make that happen. They can apply to the Chautauqua Institution for denominational status, and that is granted, and that will be granted. There's a strong interest in seeing this happen. So I would envision in the coming years, and I think it will be years down the road, before the money to purchase and renovate or to build a new house and to develop the full programs. At this stage in 2014, 2015, I see programs for the next couple of years,
Right.
and inviting people from throughout the nation to join this effort. Right. And then after that 2-year period, I would see a focus on the construction of a house.
Right. So have we had some steps this year that were significant?
There were, and in fact, the second week in 2014, around July 4th, at the President's Cottage at Chautauqua, a group of over 40 leaders gathered from around the country, including personalities like Tavis Smiley, national public broadcasting personality, who said, this really is exciting, it's important. Many of these church leaders need a place to meet and work through their differences to better serve our communities. And after all, that was the original vision of Chautauqua's pioneer founders. John Howell Benson and Lewis Miller wanted a place to build leaders for more effective churches and ministry. And that's precisely what this proposed King House would be doing.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And so it's another iteration of that practice.
Indeed.
Adapted to the current conditions and current denominations. We want to
Exactly.
give some help to.
Yeah, no, I think that's very well said. Yeah.
This has been a very enjoyable half hour together,
Thank you.
and I hope that we can be back for future interviews. Thank you for watching this edition of Chautauqua People. My name is John Viehe.